Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It's a great pleasure to see you here today. We are going to move briskly because we have only an hour to talk about 100 years or more of world history. So, you know, brevity is, or speed is necessary. Let me begin by just very briefly introducing the panel, though I think you know pretty much all about them. Niall Ferguson. The thing I must always remember to say is to introduce their latest book, because that's why they're here, to sell it. So, you know. So Niall's latest book is The Square and the Tower, Networks, Hierarchies and the Struggle for Global Power. A very apt title for a man who is truly a global networker in terms of moving all over the world and lecturing and talking and so on. And he's also written, of course, on the First World War, which is another reason why he's here. Allan Mallinson, novelist, army officer, and someone who's now written 3 books in recent succession on the First World War. The most recent one, the one you've got to buy, Fight to the Finish, is just about to be published in October. David Olusoga, known to you from, most recently from his Civilizations, his participation in the Civilizations series on television, BBC Two, prolific author and TV writer and presenter, here particularly because of his book, The World's War, but many other things that have been about the global First World War, and that's something we want to talk about. And Margaret MacMillan. Margaret recently retired as warden of St Anthony's College, Oxford. I always think warden, it's like you run a prison or something like that. But
I did my best.
Right, okay. So, ex-warden, shall we say, who has, if you like, bookended the First World War with 2 major books, Paris, 1919, prize-winning book on the peace conference, and then more recently the war that ended peace, about the coming of the First World War. So, 4 distinguished panellists. I think I'm here because I wrote a book called The Long Shadow about the legacies of the Great War. And in a way, that's what we've decided we want to talk about, because we did not choose the title or the subtitle of this, and we thought if we're going to spend the hour talking about was the Great War justified, we would get into philosophy and theology and the whole theory of the just war and so on, which we've unilaterally decided we're not going to do. So if the organisers don't like it, tough. But what we're going to talk about is how did the people fighting this war, getting into it, how did they imagine it? How did they imagine it would turn out? Was it in any sense worthwhile for anybody, assuming that war is worth doing? And how did it shape the world we're still living in? As a way of warming up, because these are diffident, restrained, shy people, they're going to just give us a few bullet points for 3 minutes each, just to give us a sense of where they're coming from, what their voice is on this, and then we're going to discuss it, and all being well, have plenty of time for questions as well. So the title, The Pity of War, comes from a book Niall wrote more than 20 years ago. The title itself is, of course, adapted from Wilfred Owen. So, Niall, I think you were going to say just a little bit about how you view that book now, 20 years later.
Thanks, David. Well, first of all, it's a huge pleasure to be here at Clifton, and congratulations to the organisers of this great festival, now in its 2nd year, especially to my old friend Andrew, who just introduced us, and to Natalie, who's played a crucial role in bringing us all here. Yeah, it's hard to believe that The Pity of War was published 20 years ago. In fact, I'm in complete denial about that. The motivation for writing that book was personal. My grandfather, on my father's side, had served as a very young man in one of the Highland regiments. I grew up under the shadow of the war. The school I attended, Glasgow Academy, was a war memorial dedicated to the dead. And say not that the brave die was a motto I saw every day of my childhood, nearly. The central puzzle for me as I grew up was, how could one possibly justify the immense sacrifice that the war had imposed. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the war, which it's sometimes easy to forget, 65 million people, mostly men, were mobilized in the course of the war from 20 countries. There were about 10 million military deaths and roughly the same number of civilian deaths, and that doesn't include the huge number of people who died in the influenza pandemic that would almost certainly not have been so severe had it not been for all the troop movements. In 7 countries, one I think was Scotland, more than 10% of all the men aged 15 to 49 died prematurely because of the war. And it's hard to see that anybody won. The country which in many ways started it was Serbia, in the sense that it was a Serb-sponsored terrorist attack that acted as the catalyst, but the Serbian population was more devastated than any other. Something like a quarter of all the men over 15 lost their lives in the war. The argument of the book, and I'll be very brief, was that it was a huge mistake, and everybody had miscalculated, but the most important miscalculation was the British one, because it was Britain's intervention on August 2nd, or the decision to intervene on August 2nd, 1914, that turned it into a world war. It would not have been a global conflict had not Britain decided to intervene. And I argued in the book that that was not inevitable. In fact, it was a highly contingent decision taken by a deeply divided cabinet, most of whose members hadn't expected to decide to intervene that morning. The last point I'll make is that The Pity of War's a quite economic book. It's not really a book of military history in the traditional sense. And its observation is that if Britain had been properly prepared for a war with Germany, it would have been able to win it relatively easily. But because absolutely no preparation had been made and the decision was taken at the last minute, it proved extremely difficult for Britain to win the war despite massive superiority in demographic and economic and financial terms. And the reason for that is that, and I tried to show this in a somewhat iconoclastic way in the book, the Germans were really much better at killing people than we were. And they did it more efficiently from an economic point of view. And that's why the war took so long to be fought, to be decided, and why in the end it could only be decided with American intervention. So from my point of view, 20 years on, I've no real reason to change that argument, despite the fact that I think I've failed to convince the majority of historians, and it remains a minority view.
So it's a bad war, but you were right. Yeah, okay,
well,
good.
It's a bad war, and that's precisely why I was right, because in no way did the outcome justify the vast sacrifice and also the strategic damage that it did to Britain's position.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that as we go along a lot more. Alan, do you want to make, as it were, your pitch on how you're thinking about this sort of question?
Well, let's just look at the Cabinet's problem at the end of July, when July 1914, when they realised this, that they had a problem. They didn't discuss the situation in Europe until the 29th of July. Ireland was a much more consuming problem. I agree with Niall, the Cabinet was split. Was it absolutely necessary to go to the support of France? If it came to war, the Entente Cordiale was not a binding compact. However, there have been so many subordinate decisions made under the overarching umbrella of the Entente Cordiale that the French certainly thought it was a binding commitment, and both the British War Office acted as if it were, which is my major criticism of our lack of preparation, and so did the Admiralty, although rather more prudently. The thing that clenched it, the thing that united the Cabinet, all parties in Parliament except the Labour Party, who refused to endorse the war, the thing that united it was the German invasion of Belgium, which was in clear violation of an extant treaty, 1839 Treaty of London, which required us to uphold the neutrality of Belgium. I don't see how any British cabinet could have reneged on such a commitment, maintaining honour, maintaining its position in the world. The exact comparison is 1982 and the seizing of the Falklands, a rock of no consequence in the South Atlantic. But as a number of people argued with the cabinet, which was vacillating at the time for intervention in the Falklands, if we let this go, our position in the world will count for nothing. So those are the stakes. I do not believe, as Niall suggests, that having taken that decision, our lack of preparation meant automatically that the war was going to be a war of massive casualties, that we were going to make such a botch of it as we did. The botch came from myopic planning in the War Office beforehand with insufficient political control because the politicians basically weren't interested because they didn't expect it to come to this, which gave the General Staff a free hand to hatch a harebrained plan to send the tiny British Army, 1/10 of the size of the French, to go and fight a big man's war. Most of them were killed within the first 6 months. We then had to improvise an army. We signed up to a lunatic French doctrine of attack in all circumstances, and it consistently wiped out every progressive wave of recruits. We threw away our greatest hand, which was the infinite flexibility that our overwhelming sea power gave us. Look at the Dardanelles, the only bit of strategy worth the name in the war, thrown away by crass military application of a brilliant strategic idea. And my view is that, yes, we were ill-prepared, the Germans were magnificently prepared, the Russians were better prepared than the Germans thought they were, the French were over-prepared in that they thought they knew what the Germans would do and had a better plan to counter it. The Germans did something completely different and they were stuffed. And we, the British, were completely ill-prepared. It wasn't inevitable.
Right, so this is a war for our credibility as a power which is conducted with a truly incredibly bad strategy and planning.
Yes.
Okay. David, you don't have to follow on from that, but what's your take on what we're going to be talking about?
Well, I'd like to take it back, if I may, to this issue of was the war worth it? And to talk about personal experiences. This time last week, I was filming for the BBC in Saint-Sylvestre Cemetery in Belgium, where by total chance, the man who's believed to be the first British casualty, a victim of the Battle of Mons, the BEF that Allan was talking about, is laid, and literally a few yards away is the last British casualty of the war, and a few yards from him is the last Canadian casualty of the war. And I've always found it difficult. I've been going to those cemeteries for 20 years. I've always found it very difficult to stand in a sea of Portland stone headstones and really feel that this was worth it. The historical evidence that I've thought about and written about, it's difficult to grasp onto that when you're standing around, and then especially when you look at the ages on some of those headstones. But then I think about another cemetery of sorts that I've stood in, and by chance I'm on the panel with one of the few people in the world who's also stood in that cemetery, and cemetery is too glamorous a word. It's a mass grave dug into a riverbed outside the Namibian town of Luderitz, where the bodies of two ethnic groups, the Herero and the Nama, were dumped by German prisoners, so German prison guards, after they'd been taken from a place called Shark Island, which I think there's a strong case for saying wasn't a concentration camp, and there were many concentration camps in what was then the German colony of Southwest Africa between 1904 and 1908. I would say that Shark Island personally was an extermination camp. When I wrote about German colonialism, having already spent a long time reading about the first months of the First World War, what happened in Belgium, there was a horrible sense of familiarity when you read about the accounts, which were often dismissed as propaganda at the time of what happened, what the German army was capable of doing to Belgian civilians. It's horribly familiar if you also read German colonial history. It's difficult to dismiss the idea that this war had to be fought, because to do so you have to convince yourself that the Germany of Kaiser Wilhelm II wasn't an existential threat to the countries around her, to Britain's empire. And I struggle to do that. I think Germany, it's hard to imagine a war without Germany. It's hard to imagine a German victory that doesn't create a stronger Germany that is still antagonistic to Britain. I would love to believe, and I like to believe when I'm in those terrible cemeteries in Belgium and France, that this was a war that wasn't worth it. But read the September programme, read what Germany's war aims are very soon after the start of the war. And I have to, reluctantly say, I think it was a war that had to be fought.
Good. Okay, well, we're getting a range of views. Margaret, you look at this partly from a Canadian point of view, but also as someone who's written about the beginning and the end of the war. What's your take on this question we're trying to talk about?
Well, I think we've got it from all three of you, a very good idea of why the war is so contested and why we argue about it so much. And we argue about its beginnings, we argue about how it was fought, we argue about its justice, we argue about its consequences. I mean, it's been estimated that in English there's some 30,000 works on the origins alone, which of course I read for my book when I did it.
Including the indexes.
Including the indexes, yes.
Very important, yeah.
But I think, you know, the fact is it happened, and we'll go on wondering about it. And I think we go on wondering about it because its consequences were so momentous. I mean, at a personal level, the sort of level that Niall and Allan and David have talked about, the loss of a generation, the loss of all those young men, and it was mainly young men, and those who came back from the war and who were never really going to recover from it again. I mean, I speak for myself, I'm probably the last generation who knew people who were actually in the war. But it did cast, as David's book title says, a very long shadow. I think there are all sorts of personal losses for the war. I think we should remember, though, that people didn't regard it in the same ways in different countries. I mean, for Canada, it was actually a moment when we came of age, and we became less in awe of the British, and we began to think that they sometimes got it wrong. And then we concluded by the end of the war that they usually did. And so this was a very important stage for our full independence. And I think commemoration of the war has been different in different countries. The Russians don't really like to think about it very much because it's tied up with the revolution, which they don't like to think about very much. The Germans have other things to think about. And so it's only in certain countries that I think we commemorate it as much. But I think looking sort of at the last 100 years, I think we can say the world would have been very different without the war. Some things were probably going to change anyway. The empires were probably eventually going to move at least to more autonomy and independence, perhaps disappear, but I think the war speeded that up. The decline of Europe, I think, was sped up by the First World War. There were already challenges in Japan, in the United States, and possibly one day in China. Nobody knew in 1918 what would happen to China. But I think if you look at the Europe before 1914, it was the center of the world. It was the most powerful part of the world. It was where you came to borrow money. It was where you came to get ideas. It was where you came to get fashions. It was where you wanted to come if you were anywhere from around the world, because that was where power was, and that's where things were happening, and that's where the exciting things were happening. And Europe wasn't the same after the First World War, and Europeans themselves knew it. I mean, a very common image, I mean, a French poet said, a spring is broken, something's broken, you know, we'll never be the same. And I think there was this terrible feeling that everything we took pride in, our civilization, produced these horrors of the fronts, the Western Front, the Eastern Front, the front in the Balkans, the front in the Middle East. I think what the war also did was speed up the disappearance of the multinational empires. I mean, we tend to think, wrongly I think, that it was inevitable that Austria-Hungary would disappear, that the Russian Empire would disappear, that the Ottoman Empire would disappear. I don't think it was. All those empires were changing. Russia was moving, and it was painful, and it was difficult, and it was by fits and starts. It was moving to more constitutional government. It was moving towards a different sort of Russia. Austria-Hungary was beginning to deal with its nationalities, giving them more autonomy, and the ways in which people were beginning to build multiple identities, as they always had done in Austria-Hungary. And the Ottoman Empire was modernizing. And so I think the First World War changes at a personal level, at a national level, but also at an international level, the world in which we now live. And the world in which we live is very much shaped by it. I mean, the rise of the United States was already happening. But what happened in the First World War is the United States moved into markets which it hadn't been in before. And it also began its process, which didn't come easily to Americans, of translating its economic and demographic and geographical power into military power. And so I think if we look back 100 years later, we can go on, I think we will go on arguing about should it have been fought, was it worth it? But I think what is clear is that our world is very much shaped by it.
David, one point that hasn't been made, which I think is very relevant to this assessment of costs and benefits, is that just 20 years after the peace treaties, another even worse war broke out. Right. So that whatever the stated aims of the belligerents were, they were not in the least bit achieved. The victors didn't achieve what the Americans said they were trying to achieve, which was to end war, to achieve a completely new international order that would avoid another 1914. And the British and French, whatever they thought they were going to get out of the peace treaties, also failed. The whole object of the exercise, in a way going back to Allan's remarks, was to deal with the German problem. But if the goal was to prevent Germany becoming a major strategic threat to the British Empire, we really couldn't have failed more completely. But once again, the Germans were able to make an even more disastrous challenge in 1939. So I'd struggle with all these rationalizations. It would be so much more convincing if there had been an enduring containment of Germany, but nothing of the kind
But
happened.
that's a failure of the peace rather than of the victory and the peace, rather than the failure of going to war, you could argue.
But the nature of the peace is determined by the way we fought the war. Having taken so many casualties, and by my calculations, and these things are impossible to establish definitively, but I believe that in England, excluding Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, in England, probably 1 in 3 men under the age of 30 of military age were killed in that war, as much as 1 in 3, certainly no fewer than 1 in 6. This is a massive hit on the national psyche, on the military psyche. We were exhausted in 1918. We gave up fighting too soon. We were not able to impose on Germany the sort of unconditional surrender terms that could have perhaps guaranteed the development of a reasonably stable political 20 years. And some people saw that. Marshal Foch, as he walked out of those Paris peace talks, said, this isn't a peace, it is a 20-year armistice. And my God, he was right to within a couple of months.
But he needn't have been right, if I can just come in here, because, you know, what we tend to, I mean, I think the First World War created the conditions that made the Second World War possible, but it didn't make it inevitable. You know, and I think when people say to me, well, 1919 led directly to 1939, I mean, my short answer is, what was everyone doing for those 20 years? You know, there were a lot of decisions made, and if you looked at the 1920s, and more historians, I think, are now looking at it, Europe was recovering economically. It was beginning to build stable governments. It wasn't perfect, and there were endless problems in the successor states, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and in Germany itself. But Germany was becoming part of the international community again. And I think if things had gone in a different way, if it hadn't been for the Great Depression, it's quite possible that Germany, and Weimar only had 10 years, you know, about 10 years. If it had had longer, I think things could have turned out otherwise. I'm not saying this to try and defend the First World War, but not everything that happens afterwards can be laid to the end of the war.
Okay, so we've got, in a sense, two different views here. I mean, they're coming out. One is that sense that actually the crux is the, you know, what Zara Steiner called the hinge years of the Depression. That's actually when, you know, a piece that might have worked went wrong. On the other hand, what David's hinting at is really the idea, you know, talking about those mass graves and so on, is actually that question that's always lurked over this, which is, you know, the German question. The question is, was Germany an innately militaristic, aggressive, brutal power, and that, okay, we didn't do the job properly in 1418, but that's why Franklin Roosevelt insisted on having unconditional surrender in the Second World War. I mean, Neil, where do you sit on the German problem? Is that, as it were, a British parochialism?
Well, I've been grappling with that question ever since I was a junior fellow at York College, David, back in 1990.
And we didn't give you much help?
You didn't. Well, you gave me quite a lot of nice wine, and that
helped.
Well,
that's what Cambridge College is for. Right?
I mean, my career began as a historian of Germany and indeed of the Weimar Republic. When I returned to these issues to write a book called The War of the World, which attempted to link the two world wars in a broader perspective, the conclusion that I was left with was that if you try to understand the 20th century from 30,000 feet, that there are three things going on that cause extreme lethal conflict to happen in certain places at certain times. Because remember, the violence is very geographically concentrated and very concentrated in time too. It doesn't happen anything like so much in Canada as it happens in Ukraine. And so the three things that seem to predict where conflict will happen and when it will happen our economic volatility, and the Great Depression was only one of the shocks. There was a huge post-war shock, inflationary in some cases, deflationary in others. And then this phenomenon of ethnic disintegration, multi-ethnic states falling apart. Britain had this experience because, of course, Ireland's civil war and then the creation of the Republic in the South happened in the immediate aftermath, and partly because of the war. And then empires in decline more broadly, the fact that there were these post-imperial regions where nobody was quite in control in Central and Eastern Europe. So one can take this sort of the view from 30,000 feet and say, well, it was always pretty likely that Central and Eastern Europe would be very violent places in the 20th century because all those things were going on there, just as it's likely that the Middle East would be a pretty violent place in our time because those structural forces have been at work. But let me come back to the question of what would have happened if Britain had stood aside, or at least taken a different military approach, not sent the British Expeditionary Force, but opted for what I'll call the 1790s approach. Let's hold back, let the others do the dirty work, use our naval power and wait to send troops when the time is right. I think David's argument that this would have been a grave, David Olusoga's argument, this would have been a great mistake, really needs to be carefully unpacked. In The Pity of War, I did one of my first voyages into counterfactual history, explicitly asking what the world would have been like had the cabinet acted differently on that fateful day on August the 2nd. And one important point that emerges is that had Britain held back, it's not clear that the Germans would have ever published the September programme. The September programme was a very radical blueprint designed partly to mobilise the German population that took for granted Britain's intervention. Had we held back, the Germans would not have been, I think, anything like so ambitious. They would have been incentivised to try to keep us out. They'd hoped to keep Britain out. That was one of the reasons they miscalculated in 1914. And I therefore think that you can imagine a completely different world in which Britain holds back, the French lose. I think without a sustained British presence into 1916, there would have been no way for France to withstand the casualties. Remember, the French lose about 500,000 men in the first 6 months of the war. It ought to have been 1870, it ought to have been 1940. Perhaps the most surprising thing about the First World War is that the French don't collapse. And I think without Britain's support and without the prospect of increasing British troops, I think the French would have struggled to keep the war going.
Certainly if they'd kept to their doctrine of we attack no matter what the circumstances.
Right, and this was self-attrition.
Yeah.
I think in that scenario of a more limited, mostly European war, the German war aims would have been more limited. And here's the key point that I made in the Pity of War. A German victory would not have strengthened Germany, and here I disagree with you, David. It would have given the Germans enormous problems because they would have had to manage all the mess of territorial acquisition to the east. The idea that acquiring more of Eastern Europe beyond the then borders of Prussia, that would have made Germany stronger, I think misunderstands what a very difficult part of the world that was. So I think one has to imagine a scenario in which Germany achieves a continental victory and then finds itself struggling to manage a Großdeutschland, an enlarged Germany, while Britain holds in reserve its global resources as it had in dealing with Napoleonic France, and therefore retains the dominant position in global geopolitics. That's the real counterfactual that the book sketches, and I stand by that, because I think it's more plausible than David's vision of Wilhelmine Germany doing what it did in Namibia all over Europe. I don't think that would have happened, David, even allowing for the so-called Belgian atrocities.
We need to move on, but David, do you want to come back on that particular point?
Well, I think you have to convince yourself that the peace at the end of a German victory in late 14, probably more like the spring of 1915, would have been more like the peace at the end of the Franco-Prussian War and less like Brest-Litovsk. Now, there's no question the war radicalizes Germany. That Germany's war aims become more extreme as the war goes on, and Brest-Litovsk is a response to the casualties.
Peace treaty between Germany and Russia. Yeah.
But the September program is September.
Yeah.
The radicalization has happened very quickly. You also have to compare the leadership of Germany in the Franco-Prussian War to the leadership of the Kaiser and the cabal around him. I am not comfortable with the idea that we would not have seen a radical peace, a radical settlement, an acquisition that would have strengthened Germany. There's a phrase, I can't remember which of the, I think it's a Foreign Office report after Brest-Litovsk, and it says Germany will now have the strength to fight the world forever. Now that is 1917, that is after 3 years of war. I think the signs of that radicalism, that extremism, that hyper-militarism is there in 1914, and if the September program was September 1916, I'd think it was all the product of war, but it's so soon after the war.
Okay, well, you can see there's a wide variety of views. One of the things we want to do is not spend all our time on the Western Front, stuck in the trenches and all the rest of it. What we'd like to do now is just think some of the other aspects of this war and its legacies that don't always figure in our slightly, I think, parochial view of it in Britain. So, for example, you've already been talking about Eastern Europe and so on. If you talk about this war to people in Eastern Europe, they have a rather different view. The Baltic states have recently been celebrating their 100 years of independence from Russian rule. If you ask many Poles about this war, it's a war in which their country recovered its shape as a state, admittedly in a contested sense, after being partitioned for a century or more between Germany, between Prussia, Russia and Austria, Hungary. For many of these people, these are wars of liberation. So how should we think about that conflict in the larger European sense? And then we'll try and move on to the global sense.
Very briefly, I think the key thing we haven't talked about yet is social democracy, socialism. Right. What went wrong for the Baltic states, what went wrong for much of Eastern Europe was the Russian Revolution. Now, it's worth remembering what exactly happened. It was the Germans who sent Lenin as an agent with considerable resources into Russia to destabilize the Russian regime, and it worked. It worked way better than they foresaw and created a massive revolutionary wave that ultimately claimed Germany as well. And I think perhaps it's appropriate to reflect on the significance of Lenin's contribution now that a Leninist is poised to become prime minister in this country.
I thought you'd get that in. Yes. Well, you heard that here.
History lives, it lives on, and yet people don't really learn its lessons. So bear in mind that the whole project of socialism had a kind of made in Germany stamped on it, going right the way back to the mid-19th century. That the Germans, although they had a far right, no question, they also had a far left. They had the biggest social democratic party on the eve of World War I. This was their problem, that they had at the same time a militaristic elite and a really quite left-of-centre electorate, not to mention universal male suffrage that empowered that electorate. So this is a really important variable to introduce into the discussion. It was one reason that the elites in all these countries felt so insecure that at least some of them were willing to gamble on a war in the hope that it would somehow reduce the threat of the left from within. It was a gamble that totally went wrong. Absolutely. But it meant that nationalism, as it sprung up in places like the Baltic states, had a very brief efflorescence before it was sat on by the growing power of what became the Soviet Union. All of those achievements of the post-war period were contingent on what happened to Russia. And the most surprising outcome in many ways of the war and the revolutionary period was that this bunch of extremists who came to power with German backing, who seemed like a complete lunatic fringe in 1917, were able to reconstitute the Russian Empire and then make it even larger and more powerful than it had originally been on the basis of an extreme version of Marxism. That's really the most surprising outcome of the war.
And going back to what Margaret was saying about the fall of multinational empires, this is the Russian Empire is the one of the four that actually does reconstitute itself in somewhat truncated borders under different leadership. Whereas Austria-Hungary is a thing of the past, the Ottoman Empire is, the German Empire is, and so on. So that, I mean, do you feel that that is something that is quite fundamental, the way that it unhinged most of multinational, imperial Europe but it reconstituted that in a way that had a lasting effect all through the 20th century.
Yes, I do, and I think but the reconstitution of the Russian Empire was under a particular ideology.
Yeah, that's right.
Which was going to
the two things together,
do its best to
Empire,
crush
people
on the basis of their class and their ethnicity. And what you got in the center of Europe was these ethnically based states, which of course had huge ethnic minorities of their own. I mean, they were mini empires in a way. And you got, unfortunately, with the introduction of electoral politics, what you got was an overlapping of class, ethnicity, race often, political views, and there was very little, I think, willingness for people to cooperate. It really just fueled conflict. And I think that is one of the most unfortunate legacies. I mean, there was talk of trying to reconstitute, at least economically, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. General Smuts had this plan to try and build a Danubian economic area, which would have actually been better for people.
As a kind of framework for stability.
Yes, because I mean, what happened, of course, is people in Vienna were starving because they could no longer get the food that used to come from Hungary, or they could no longer get the fuel that used to come from Romania. Suddenly borders had gone up. And a lot of these new states were not prepared to cooperate with each other because they all had border disputes. There were a whole lot of series of wars that went on after 1919. And Winston Churchill said the war of the giants has ended and the war of the pygmies has started. And he was right. And Europe in the center saw conflict at least till 1925. And I think what was also a legacy of the war and was going to persist was that politics often became very violent. I mean, it's not that it hadn't been violent before the First World War, but I think you got increasing use of brutality in the streets, rioting in the streets, beating people up, a lot of assassinations. I think Niall may remember the figure, but something like 300 Weimar officials were assassinated and politicians in the first few years of Weimar. And people now were resorting to extra legal and extra constitutional means to deal with their opponents. And there's a lot of debate about whether the new brutality in European politics was in part a result of the war, although it didn't happen so much in France and Britain. But I think there was a general sense that moorings had been slipped and the new world was not satisfying a lot of people.
Can I just pick up on this extraordinary business of the Germans taking Lenin in his sealed train to Russia to foment that revolution? I mean, this to me is a wonderful insight into the German militarized mind, the whole leadership at the time, that they're prepared to precipitate a communist revolution in the East, fearing as they did internally the communist threat to Germany, because the military situation, the logic of the military situation they were in, demanded it. It's an almost sort of Clausewitzian loss of a grip on the wider context of conflict, which is, of course, why the Germans ultimately lose at war. So we shouldn't. I don't
know if I agree with you, Allan, because we were doing exactly the same kind of thing, except more successfully, because we fomented Arab nationalism against the Ottoman Empire, where, of course, nationalism ultimately posed a mortal threat to Britain's empire. I think everybody engaged in this kind of warfare, trying to undermine the other side by fair means or foul. The Germans also tried totally disastrously to do the same with Islam.
The stakes, you know, the basic reason that Germany felt threatened and went to war was the fear of Russia, and yet look what they engineered. Sorry, could I ask another? But one point that I
quickly as
I can. We haven't talked about the Americans, who, in my view, joined the war too late and then left it too quickly. Might they take some blame?
Well, I'm now an American, so I take that very personally.
Can we?
Well, without American intervention,
yes, I mean, let's talk about it quickly, and then So I mean, that would be basically your view. They should have come in earlier.
Well, no, I mean that's. You know, we talk about, but the very fact that Wilson facilitated peace terms, which he assumed would be underwritten by his League of Nations and various other high-blown ideas, and then failed to be able to deliver on the League of Nations, and therefore created a situation that he, well, of course, they went back to an isolationism because the Senate wouldn't endorse membership of the League of Nations. So, having created a weak peace, they then left the ground.
Well, they didn't entirely. You know, they didn't join the League of Nations, and that was partly Wilson's fault. In fact, there was probably majority support for some form of League of Nations, both in the United States and in the Senate. But the Americans continued to work with the League. They had observers at the League. They took part in the big disarmament conferences. They played, you know, I think the isolationism can be overstated. They do turn away a bit. But you can see the American point of view. I mean, they had come in, a lot of people felt they shouldn't have come in. What American stakes were at interest? They'd done their best to make a peace. The Europeans had failed to follow up. I mean, I have a certain sympathy for the American point of view, but I do think we shouldn't overstate the isolationism. They remained, I think, really quite engaged in Europe.
There was also large-scale US investment in Europe after the war.
Particularly in Germany.
And so that's another point in Margaret's favour. But I think it's important to realise how different this war looks to Americans. It's not something that they think a great deal about. It's a far less significant event in American history. And there's also a very powerful legacy of the recriminations of the 1920s, the sense that this had all been done for JP Morgan's benefit, you know, to bail out the bondholders who'd lent money to the Entente powers. I mean, that wasn't entirely untrue. No. The situation was one in which Wall Street had lent heavily to Britain and from Britain to France and Russia. And when things started to look really grim in 1917, American intervention started to be a necessity for financial reasons. Many Americans, and this gave rise to the isolationism of the interwar period, thought, and not, I think, without some justification, that the US had been drawn into the war for financial reasons. And there's still quite a legacy of that thinking about the First World War. It's why it doesn't get glorified in the same way that we're inclined to glorify it in Europe. There's no sentimentality about the First World War.
You can see that in the way that this centenary is such a big event in this country. It's not in America. I always think that the fact that the America's First World War Museum is in Kansas City is a way of making the point that this is a war we don't want to discuss.
It is a good museum, though it doesn't
really address Let's keep off museums. We don't get stuck there. This is a global war.
The Ottoman Empire.
Let's talk about the global dimensions of this war, because I mean, if you just use the names Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Palestine, Israel, you are right at the heart of problems that are with us today, issues that are with us today, and are direct legacies of the war. David, do you want to talk about some of that?
I think if you were going to... I mean, one of the problems that those of us who think that the war had to be fought have is that we have to say that there's a potential scenario that's worse than the 20th century. And it's quite difficult when you lay out the events that we all know to come up with something that was worse. But I think in the early 21st century, if you're looking at our lives, we're looking at the wars that we're currently in, you'd have to say one of the most important legacies of the war is the end of the caliphate. We have terrorist organizations that we are at war with now who want to reconstitute a caliphate, a position which most people don't discuss as an outcome of the First World War. The end of the caliphate, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, and the joining of lines.
You've got to explain what that means.
The leadership of the Islamic world being centered in the hands of a sultan with a position that goes right back to the early followers of the Prophet. That was the Ottoman Sultan from the 14th century onwards, 15th century onwards. There is no caliphate now. ISIS is about reconstituting the caliphate, as well as about, as they said when they released their first of sadly many videos, it's about destroying Sykes-Picot, the agreement to draw the lines in the sand in Arabia. I think where we are now, we'd have to say that was one of the great consequences of the First World War, and one of the difficulties those of us who think that the war had to be fought have to confront. That is one of our weakest arguments.
And the arguments over what to do with the Middle East, particularly between the British and the French, you mentioned Sykes-Picot, are a direct consequence of the fact that suddenly there are opportunities opening up, and ideas which were simply not on the map before become war aims of a serious nature.
You have two powers who go to war to protect the status quo, to protect the empire, imperial claims they already have. They're not trying to expand their empire. But the moment the opportunity is there, the moment the territories are laid out on the table, the feast begins.
Yeah, they're greedy for it, or at least they're determined not to let anybody else get them. So, yeah.
Two enormously consequential things that haven't been mentioned, one good and the other very bad indeed. the idea of a Jewish home in Palestine is something that really only could have happened in the context of the war, and it was the consequence really of Britain and Germany bidding to win over a broader Jewish support for their war efforts, and Britain winning. The other thing that hasn't been mentioned yet is the genocide against the Armenians. The Ottoman Empire itself is radicalized by the war, and in some ways the way in which the Armenians are massacred is one of the first and most hideous genocides on a much larger scale than had happened in Namibia, and I think it's important to recognise that that's one of the many disastrous consequences of this war. That in many ways all the multinational empires are radicalised by the experience of conflict, and they move in the direction of a more intolerant nationalism, and that's not really viable in the context of the Middle East or Central and Eastern Europe without ethnic cleansing and genocide. That was the great danger of starting to think you could solve the war on the basis of self-determination. Once you look at the ethnic map of everywhere except Western Europe, you realise that that's simply not viable.
The war brings to an end processes that were happening in the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, the idea of Ottomanism, that you can have a dual identity. There were positive steps emerging in both of those multi-ethnic empires to solve that problem of how do you have what many people have today, which is comfortable dual identities.
And I mean, one other thing we haven't mentioned, and we talk about the death toll from the fighting, but of course there is a far greater death toll from, as it were, another unintended consequence of this war, which is the global influenza pandemic. And I mean, we were talking just earlier on, I mean, a lot of that has to do with troop movements and movements of germs, all the rest of it, right?
Well, the example I think speaks most loudly is that there's work done in the 1920s that shows the movement of vast armies of carriers rather than soldiers in Africa, moving from Tanzania all the way down to Malawi and Portuguese Mozambique and into the Congo in this long, what's been called a dark safari, this war against a German unit led by Letov Vorbeck. That movement of people actually changes the epidemiological map of the African continent, and diseases that had not been present in 1914 in parts of the continent emerge in 1918. And the map of where diseases operate, where they can be contracted, is altered by the war at a biological level. I think that speaks loudly of...
So, as you can see, we've only had a short time, but stuff happens between 1418, and it's been falling out ever since. We want to have some time for questions. There are 2 roving mics. Please put your hand up, wait for the mic, and it will come to you. Just mention your name, please, and ask a question rather than making a comment, let alone a speech, if I may put it bluntly. So, who has a hand up ready to ask a question?
We've answered them all. Yeah.
Sorry, if you can see, the lights are rather difficult for me to see. Are any hands up? Yeah, there's one there, so thank you.
On the topic of history repeating itself, I'm going to mention the word Brexit. I, as a constitutional lawyer who helped write the European Convention on Human Rights and implement it, etc., I feel that the EU, at the base level, was formed for peace and economic prosperity. Do you think we're not learning the lesson by trying to keep that together? Do you think that we are just heading for breaking up the thing we put together to help?
Okay, I think we probably ought to avoid a direct discussion on Brexit, but let us ask your larger question is really, do people learn lessons from the past? Do any of us think lessons have been seriously learned from?
Well, much the most inflammatory part of The Pity of War, which, remember, was written 20 years ago, is the argument that if the Germans had won, they would have created the Kaiser's European Union. If you go back to the things the Germans discussed before the war began, rather than what happened in the aftermath of its outbreak, there was all kinds of discussion of creating a European customs union in which Germany would be dominant. And so when I was trying to be provocative I'm not so provocative.
No,
these
I know
days.
that. No.
I suggested that you might have ended up getting to the outcome of a German-dominated customs union rather more quickly if you just let them win in 1914 or 1916, going through all the agonies of trying to stop them in 2 world wars. I think one of the great fallacies in the debate on European integration, and I do wish it could be laid to rest, it appears in all speeches by European commissioners and European politicians, is that the European Union is the reason we have had peace in Europe since the end of World War II. It's simply not true. That the one thing that the European Union has not really been about has been defence. The idea of a defence union was torpedoed by the French, and the reason that there's been peace in Europe since the end of World War II has much more to do with NATO than it has to do with Europe, which was an economic project. Yeah. So it would be great if we could at least stop making that fallacious argument, which I think is one of the weakest arguments in defence of the European Union that there's ever been.
And to go back to the question, I mean, and what Allan said earlier, in a sense that NATO is the product of the United States learning in its own mind the lessons of 2 world wars and making an unprecedented peacetime commitment to the security of Europe in the North Atlantic Treaty. But that, if you like, is an example of quote-unquote lessons learned over 25, 30 years at huge human cost. Yeah. Anybody else want to come in on the question of do we learn lessons of history?
Statesmen can, or statespeople can. I mean, if you look at the institutions that were set up at the end of the Second World War, they very much came out of the experience of the end of the First World War and the experience of the 1930s. I mean, the international economic institutions, the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, but also the United Nations. And I think Roosevelt was very wary both of, he certainly wanted unconditional surrender. He didn't want any question about who'd lost this time. But he also wanted to make sure that the United States stayed engaged this time. And so he made it a bipartisan effort. And I think what we have to worry about today, and I will not name any names, but there seems to me there are certain leaders of countries who don't know the slightest bit of history and don't think it has anything useful to offer. And that's worrying.
But what's striking also, you said, the lessons of the Second World War in the 30s, I think of it in generational terms, the people who were shaping the post-war European international world in the 1940s were people who had lived through 2 world wars. And it was that sort of cumulative sense, we screwed it up once, we cannot afford to screw it up again, particularly in a nuclear age. And I wonder myself whether we have, where we are now, anybody has that almost existential push about why international institutions, whether they work or not, but at least trying to create that framework, matters in the world we live in now.
Well, there's a philosophical argument that historical memory can't survive the loss of a generation. And if that were true, it would be about now that the lessons of the Second World War would begin to evaporate. So that's not in itself proof, but it is coincidental, perhaps.
I was going to say not just lived through the First World War, some of them had fought. Churchill, Truman, Attlee, de Gaulle, these were...
Yes, well, experiential, yes.
And the later generation who'd been to... I mean, Helmut Kohl's experience as a young boy...
Yes, that's right.
In the last years of Germany,
yes, that's right. Next question, let's keep it moving. Any hands up? Back. Okay, if you can see a question at the back, please pass the microphone. Then there was somebody here, I think. There's somebody in the middle, yes. My eyesight needs all the help it can get, so thank you. Right, question at the back.
If you were teaching history to secondary school pupils now, what perspective would you give?
On the war?
On the First World War.
Right. So, I mean, since that's a huge question, I mean, the point would be, what are you really trying to get over to secondary school children, right?
Yes.
No, okay. Who wants to go with that?
I'd want to put them in the position of the British Cabinet in the last days of July and the first days of August 1914 and show that these are people who are in an incredible dilemma. They take it incredibly serious. They're not throwing the lives of young men or the futures of their country away, and they are in a situation where they are doing their absolute best to weigh up a terrifying dilemma.
So your instinct would be to put, as a way of education, is actually to put young people in a position where they have to try and make these decisions on the basis of whatever evidence you provide, right?
I think those few days, as the decision is being reached, Lloyd George changing his position, the news coming in from Belgium. I think they're an object lesson in the fact that the hardest thing we do as people is try to run countries. And we have a flippancy about statesmanship and politics, a cynicism that these are all people who are in it for themselves. These were seriously, highly educated, capable people in an incredible dilemma doing their best.
And many of them in several capitals had really almost nervous breakdowns afterwards, just going over those days and thinking, what did I do?
But could you, I think you'd not start there. You want to, because remember, it's hard if you're a teenager to identify with Herbert Asquith. Start with the war experience. People you're teaching are closer in age to the people who fought. And, you know, my grandfather was 16 when he tried to volunteer. They found out he was too young, but the very next year he was in, you know, in training, and he ended up spending much of the war in and out of the Western Front. I mean, for me, the way to begin a lesson is to try to give a sense of the unbearable hardships that generation endured. And that's the way to capture the attention of the average teenager before you start August the 2nd cabinet meeting.
But it's so hard to reach that. I mean, the experiences, I did some work on, I'm from the northeast of England, I did some work on the Durham Light Infantry, and their experience in the Western Front are so far from mine or from a 19-year-old today. They're not, the life in the reserve trench isn't that different to life in a mine, in an unheated miner's cottage on Tyneside. The gulf between our lives and the children today lives and the soldiers of 1915 is so vast that it's quite hard to get that empathetic relationship.
That's where diaries and letters are really crucial. And I often think the way to make history come alive is put the textbook away and go straight to primary sources so that people can hear the voices. When I was writing The Pity of War, part of what was really exciting was to engage with primary sources, not the sort of famous ones, not the war poets, but the ordinary blokes who were just writing not particularly literary letters and diaries.
But against that, the great primary source we have, of course, are the battlefields, the tunnels, the trenches, the cemeteries. We have, for this war, the greatest classroom you could possibly imagine. And I'm always humbled and surprised, and I'm reminded every time I see it, the impact that those places have on children of the age of those soldiers.
Okay, let's take another question. Microphone, you got it?
Yeah, is it working? Yeah, Jamie Webb. We've talked about the negative and horrific consequences of the First World War, but what about sort of positive aspects, you know, the development of international law, global cooperation, the peace movement, universal suffrage, gender equality, things that perhaps weren't around prior. You know, are there positive aspects? Okay,
are there positive? I mean, Margaret, I was thinking we should at some point, for example, talk about the 1918 suffrage reforms in this country. You know, I mean, would... okay, that's not fully women getting the vote, but it's substantially so. Would that have happened, do you think, without the First World War?
Well, I think wars, no, I think it probably was going to happen anyway, but it came quicker. But I think what also happened, of course, in the Representation of People Act was that the working classes got the vote as well. Yes. You got universal male suffrage and you got universal female suffrage a few years later. Wars often do bring positive consequences, and we wouldn't choose to do it that way. No. But they do. I mean, they lead to advances in science and technology. They often bring great social change for the better. I mean, I think the position of women is one where you can see real change, but also the position of the working classes. I mean, by the end of the First World War, governments realized that they couldn't have done it without people they hadn't really perhaps taken seriously before, and that was the women and the working classes. And there was a real sense that they owed them something. And I think it helped after the Second World War to build the welfare state. Again, there was a feeling that these people have suffered a lot. They've been part of the war effort every much as people fighting have been, and we have to do something about it. And, you know, there is a debate among historians, but war has helped build larger political units. And if you live in a larger political unit like the Roman Empire, you may not have full democracy, you certainly didn't in the Roman Empire, but you may actually have peace and stability in a way that living in a whole series of small, struggling, competing states doesn't give you. And so there is a debate among historians about whether the creation of these larger units is, in fact, overall a positive good, even if they're created and maintained by force.
So that is part of the sort of gruesome paradox of war, in a way, that the evil of war may have consequences which we could consider beneficial later on. Anybody else want to comment on that?
It's a slightly pessimistic inference to draw, but whenever people are making arguments for a more egalitarian policy when they're reading Thomas Piketty and lamenting the inequalities of our world today. I'm bound to point out that the only reason that the world was very, very equal, or at least that Western societies were much more equal in, say, 1950 than they are today, was because there had been 2 world wars, a Great Depression, and a good deal of inflation along the way. And it's probably rather discouraging to reflect on this, but we probably should reflect on it. One of the lessons of history is that if you really want to achieve a more egalitarian society, a world war is probably the most effective way to do it.
Yes, yes.
Don't tell Jeremy Corbyn that.
I don't want to end on that note for 2 reasons. One is because it would leave Neil with the last word, and on principle, I think that's not what we want. And secondly, I'd like to just draw, in a sense, some of the threads together, this is very briefly, from the very end of Margaret MacMillan's book, and I'm adapting the 2 points she makes that we could say about looking back from the 21st century to 1914-18. We could accuse those who took Europe into war of 2 things. And I'll make the points she makes in a rather more general way. First, a failure of imagination in not seeing how destructive such a conflict would be. A failure of imagination. And second, a lack of courage to stand up to those who said there were no choices left. Failure of imagination, an unwillingness to ask, are there choices left? As David says, we should not be critical of those who carry a burden of power that we do not hold. But those 2 points, I think, are ones that always apply to many, right across the century and right to our own present day. So thank you very much for your time and attention. May we finish with just a round of applause for the panel.